And let's bring you more now on these remarks from Liz Truss, of course running to be the next Conservative leader and Prime Minister, who said of the First Minister that she's an attention seeker and the best thing to do with Nicola Sturgeon is to ignore her. Well, let's speak to the Deputy First Minister, John Swinney, who's with us now. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Guy.
And what do you make of Liz Truss's remarks?
I think these remarks are deeply troubling and concerning. I think many people in Scotland, regardless of their politics, will be really concerned and in many cases insulted by them. Nicola Sturgeon is the democratically elected First Minister of Scotland. She represents a very sizable proportion of public opinion in Scotland. At the last Scottish Parliament elections, 48% of the public voted for Nicola Sturgeon. The Conservative leadership campaign has been conducted amongst a sort of private circle of 160,000 Conservative MPs. Nicola Sturgeon has far more democratic legitimacy than Liz Truss is going to have if she becomes the Prime Minister, and I think Liz Truss has absolutely no right or no foundation to make these remarks.
Isn't it just part of the rough and tumble of politics, though, that all politicians say things about their rivals that perhaps can sound a bit intemperate?
I think the issue that concerns me is the point about ignoring the First Minister, because what that essentially does is undermine fundamentally the argument that unionist politicians put forward that somehow Scotland is an equal partner in the United Kingdom, that we are right at the heart of the United Kingdom. Liz Truss, in one rather silly and intemperate statement, in my view, has undermined that argument because she's told us exactly what she really thinks, that Scotland should just get out of the road. Should not be listened to, should not have our concerns and views put forward by our democratically elected First Minister.
Well, you may be taking things a little bit too far, because specifically she was talking, was she not, about the issue of a second independence referendum, which of course successive Conservatives have said that they don't want to see happen at the moment. It was in that context that she was talking about ignoring Nicola Sturgeon, not on other issues.
Well, I think Liz Truss has just demonstrated why she's unfit to be an effective Prime Minister, because if it requires all that clarification for you to put to me, Gary, then I think it demonstrates that Liz Truss is not thinking in a rational and considered way about what she needs to do if she becomes Prime Minister, which seems pretty likely, but she's actually just trying to appeal to the grassroots members of the Conservative Party with insulting remarks to Scotland and to the democratic choices that people in Scotland have made.
In recent weeks, Nicola Sturgeon has called Boris Johnson a danger to democracy and said that he was corrupt. These are not exactly temperate phrases either, are they?
Well, I would point out to you, Gary, that the Conservative Party has just deposed Boris Johnson for exactly the same reasons as the First Minister was pointing out. And if you look at what numerous of Mr Johnson's colleagues have said about him, they have said exactly the same, if not worse, than what the First Minister has said about the abuse of power that Mr Johnson has presided over. So what I'm saying to you is that as a prospective Prime Minister, Liz Truss has just said that people in Scotland, their leader, should be ignored by a future United Kingdom Prime Minister. So when people are saying to us, look, we would like our two governments to work more closely together, this comment from Liz Truss demonstrates what we are up against, because I come across this frequently when I'm dealing with the United Kingdom government, a contempt for Scotland, a desire to belittle Scotland, not to hear our voice. And if you don't believe me on this, just listen to what Mark Drakeford, the Labour First Minister of Wales, says, because he says exactly the same things about how Wales is treated within the United Kingdom as Scotland is treated. Now, what my politics is about doing something about that and resolving that so that people like Liz Truss are not dominating our political future.
So are you saying that you can't work with Liz Truss?
What I'm saying is that Liz Truss has demonstrated openly and I suppose candidly, I suppose we should give her credit for that Conservative politicians at the heart of this government hold Scotland in contempt. That's what Liz Truss has done.
Well, give us an example of that, because I mean you've talked about being belittled. Who's belittling you? What have they said to belittle?
Well, I'll give you one very concrete example of that, and that's the UK Internal Market Bill, passed by the United Kingdom Parliament. lauded actually during this leadership election campaign by Rishi Sunak as a means of undermining the democratic choices of the Scottish Parliament. That's what the Internal Market Bill does in the passed by the United Kingdom Parliament under this Conservative government. Now, what that is not just an attack on me or something that's insulting to me. My personal perspective doesn't matter here. That's an attack on the democratic choices of the people of Scotland, because people in Scotland...
Well, the UK government say this is about them spending money in Scotland because, of course, Scotland has two governments.
Come off it, Gary. Go back to the 1997 referendum in Scotland, where the people of Scotland voted for a democratic Scottish Parliament that would have control over a whole range of different policy functions in Scotland. The Internal Market Bill undermines that. People of Scotland have been asked. There's been no referendum to change the decision that was made in 1997. We have been ridden roughshod over by the attitudes of the Conservative Party in the course of the last few years. Now, my point is that unless people in Scotland are prepared to stand up and to counter this particular erosion of our democracy, the Conservatives will just carry on doing more, and the comments from Liz Truss last night are an indication of exactly what's in store for us.
Well, let me tell you what Murdo Fraser said, because you, of course, called these comments from Liz Truss obnoxious. He says most people would use the word obnoxious to describe senior members of a party who took no action against sex pests in their ranks, putting at risk young men and women. I think the point he's making is that ultimately all parties have difficulties, and yours among them.
Well, all parties will have difficulties, and the Conservative Party has plenty of difficulties. And my candid advice to Murdo Fraser, an individual who I've come up against a few times electorally in Scotland and defeated on every occasion, is that people in glass houses should not throw stones.
But do you accept that there are some questions for your party to answer on these issues?
I made very clear in a broadcast interview last night that wherever any complaints come forward, they should be fully, properly and transparently investigated.
Has that happened up until now?
Well, I don't know all the details of all of these cases because I'm not privy to those details. I'm not a party office holder. I don't know the intimate details of all of these cases, but my position in principle is that wherever a complaint about the behaviour of an individual in a political party comes forward, it should be investigated in an open and transparent manner.
Well, Jordan Linden stood down as leader of North Lanarkshire Council over allegations of sexual impropriety. Is he still an SNP member?
Yes.
Should he be?
Well, that's a matter for the SNP to consider as part of the processes of investigation that are undertaken.
But in terms of your internal policies, should it be a case where if allegations are made like this, then the first thing that happens is they're no longer members?
Well, what I'm saying is that there should be an open and transparent investigative process, and it shouldn't be for me to prejudge individual cases. There should be proper processes for doing that, and I certainly shouldn't do that via the means of a radio interview.
Mr Swinney, thank you very much for your time this morning. The Deputy First Minister, John Swinney. We will speak to Murdo Fraser of the Scottish Conservatives about these Liz Truss remarks after 8.
Well, until this week, backing for Ms Truss from Scottish Conservatives has been decidedly thin on the ground. All of a sudden, though, Team Truss has secured the support of close to a third of the Conservative contingent at Holyrood. Among the number is the MSP from Mid-Scotland and Fife, Murdo Fraser. He's with us now. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Laura.
Her appearance last night, are you regretting committing your support to her now?
No, far from it. I took some time, as did many of my colleagues, to consider very carefully who we would support in this leadership race. I have to say, early on, I was not a supporter particularly of Liz Truss, but she has grown on me over the past few weeks. I think she's had a very strong campaign. I've been very impressed with her core messages. I've been very impressed too with her interest in Scotland, given that she went to school in Paisley, but not just that. In her role in government, she took a lot of time to engage with Scottish business, delivered some clear wins, for example, on trade policy, removing the Trump regime sanctions against the Scotch whisky industry. So she's got a real interest in Scotland, a good plan for the future.
But with comments like that, how do you know that they might go down well with the party faithful, but how will they go down with the wider electorate? It might makes her sound maybe not particularly well considered and not very diplomatic, perhaps.
I didn't see the whole of the hustings last night, so I'm not sure of the entire context for the answer Liz Truss gave. But I imagine what Liz Truss was referring to was the incessant and increasingly tiresome demands from Nicola Sturgeon for another independence referendum. Now, we know that
Nicola
independence
Sturgeon, the democratically elected leader, First Minister of Scotland,
who does not speak for the Scottish majority on this particular topic, because we know that
she speaks for
opinion
the
polls
Scottish,
consistently show the majority do not
public a bit
support
better than any future Conservative leader would speak for them, given that they're being elected by a tiny handful of members north of the border.
Let's just remember that, according to polling, barely a third, of the Scottish population support another independence referendum on the timescale being proposed by Nicola Sturgeon. 2/3, a vast majority of the Scottish population, do not want another independence referendum anytime soon. Liz Truss is far more in tune with the majority of Scottish opinion on this issue than Nicola Sturgeon is. So I think Liz Truss was absolutely right to say this is not the time for another referendum. I won't be sanctioning on my watch. And there are other priorities that the Scottish Government should be focusing on, not least the problems in the NHS, the appalling rate of drugs deaths we have in Scotland, trying to rebuild our economy post-COVID. These are the things the Scottish Government should concentrate on.
John Swinney, the Deputy First Minister, an hour ago. He said Liz Truss's comments were symptomatic of an attitude within the UK Government. He says Scotland is belittled and held in contempt. Is that a union of equals?
I've heard some really spicy comments from SNP politicians over the last few weeks and months towards Conservative members of the UK Government. I think we'll just ignore the manufactured outrage from John Swinney and others on this particular issue. I think what you need to do is look at Liz Truss's
you might want to ignore it, but there'll be a lot of
government.
You might want to ignore it, but there'll be a lot of people listening to this to say, hang on a second here, you're going to ignore the First Minister of Scotland and say no to an independence referendum when there is a majority for that in the Scottish Parliament. How is that listening to the voice of Scotland? How is that treating Scotland as an equal? Isn't she undermining her own argument?
Because we know that the majority of people in Scotland do not want independence and do not want another referendum anytime soon. So in taking this stance, Liz Truss is entirely in tune with mainstream public opinion in Scotland. But if you want to look at Liz Truss's commitment to Scotland, just look at the record she has in government, in delivering trade deals, removing the Trump sanctions against the Scotch whisky industry, for example. A very important announcement that came out yesterday from the Truss campaign to make permanent and extend the seasonal agricultural worker scheme that will be hugely welcomed by the Scottish farming sector in places like Perthshire, Angus, Fife, Aberdeenshire, the Lothians, where that's been a very serious issue for them. That's the sort of issue people in Scotland want to hear from her.
What makes her
going on
better
about
than
another
Rishi Sunak,
independence
then?
referendum, which is just a distraction from the key issues that really matter to people.
What makes you think that the union would be safer in Liz Truss's hands rather than Rishi Sunak? You are mentioning things that Liz Truss has gone for it. 8 of your colleagues at Holyrood have come out in favour of Rishi Sunak. They say he's delivered £172 million for 8 Scottish projects to level up in Scotland. So why would he not be better for Scotland?
I'm not going to say anything negative at all about Rishi Sunak. I think Rishi Sunak was an excellent Chancellor of the Exchequer. Should he be successful, I think he'd be an excellent Prime Minister. It's just that looking at the two of them, my preference is for Liz Truss. I think Liz Truss has demonstrated in government her commitment to Scotland. She's demonstrated in government her engagement with the Scottish Parliament. I can well remember her coming to address the Finance Committee at Holyrood while she was Chief Secretary to the Treasury and dealing very adeptly with the questions being put to her by SNP backbenchers at that particular point. I think she has a genuine commitment and interest in Scotland. She's demonstrated that. She's got a plan for the future. And that's why I and 8 of my MSP colleagues are backing her to be party leader and the next Prime Minister.
We might presume that your colleagues at Westminster would be more familiar with the two candidates. They're not coming out in support of Liz Truss. We've seen 2 of them come out in support of Rishi Sunak. Do they not know better?
I think if you look at the opinion amongst MPs, I think many people took the view that many of us did. A few weeks ago, a lot of people were not particularly familiar with Liz Truss, were not familiar with her track record or the platform she would stand on.
You were pretty lukewarm about her at the very start of this, weren't you?
As the campaign has gone on, she has grown in our estimation. There's been some very significant endorsements of Liz Truss over the last few days. We've seen that from the Chancellor and Nadeem Sawai. We saw it very significantly last night from Penny Mordaunt, a very popular figure with the party membership who commands a lot of support. So as this campaign goes, you see more and more people rallying to Liz Truss's banner. And really,
Are
what's
you just
important
are you just sort of jumping on the bandwagon because you've seen which way the wind is blowing and you think, well, I'll come out in support of the one I think might be most likely to win?
I think what really concerns Conservative Party members is picking a leader and a Prime Minister most likely to win the next general election. And according to the latest polling last night, Liz Truss is now ahead of Keir Starmer in terms of public opinion as to who would make the best Prime Minister, whereas Rishi Sunak, I'm afraid, lags a little bit behind. So on that measure,
that so many of your colleagues
Liz Truss would be the person who people would choose.
So many of your colleagues have come out in favour of Rishi Sunak this morning. They've written a letter to the Daily Telegraph. They say that in this time of crisis, we need strong, competent leadership. That suggests that they don't think they're going to get that from Liz Truss.
Look, we're having a healthy debate in the Conservative Party as to who the next leader will be. I
Are
don't
you as
believe in
split
saying
in
anything
Scotland as the
negative.
party is down south?
I don't believe in saying anything negative about a Conservative colleague who's standing for election. I'm not going to go down that route. What this shows is, within the Scottish Conservative Party, we have a healthy debate about who the next leader and Prime Minister should be. And whoever gets elected to that role will have the full support of every member of our party, because they will be committed to taking our country forward, dealing with the issues that worry people, and most importantly, being committed to keeping Scotland within the United Kingdom. I believe Liz Truss is the candidate who is best able to do that. But you know what? If she's not successful, and Rishi Sunak is, I'll be right behind him too.
And we will find out on the 5th of September. Murdo Fraser, MSP for Mid Scotland and Fife. Thank you very much indeed.